Eternal Dynamics, Millennial Teachings from the Bhagavad Gita. To understand the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, we must first consider the context. The Bhagavad Gita is perhaps one of the most ancient pieces of writing in existence. It is said to date back about 5,000 years. Some of the ancient civilizations, including India, refer to a great time cycle of 5,000 years. In this respect, we may be considering quinto-millennial teachings. That means teachings that come to us every 5,000 years in very critical times. The Gita is to be found within the great epic poem of 100,000 couplets, the Mahabharata. This is the story of a great war that ended a corrupt and rotten civilization. The Gita, in a little more than 700 couplets, is the teachings that prepared the survivors to become the leaders of the subsequent great civilization. The Gita is spoken on the eve of the great war between members of the same family. It was a family feud, a civil war, which could not be avoided. It was a necessary and inevitable war that was the logical consequence of the karma of the ancestors of the warring factions. This ancient poem is symbolic, encrypted, and over the centuries was added to and altered. In particular, during the 8th century of the current era. This occurred when the religious movement of Shankaracharya rewrote all the great scriptures of India in order to demonstrate that the Vedas constitute the real and ancient information, whereas the rest is mere mythology and legend. Civilization is a matter of ideas. European colonization of the Americas, the Orient, Africa, and India was partly an effort to grab great riches from these fallen or falling civilizations, and partly to assert global hegemony and to impose the religious, political, and philosophical dominance of European culture. India was particularly resistant to European religious and philosophical ideas, being fiercely proud of its own. The 19th century British Lord Thomas Babington Macaulay led the effort to undermine the Indian people's pride of their own culture, without which they could not be overcome. Part of the resistance to European colonial takeover of India was to begin publishing the Gita with a picture of Krishna manipulating his discus on the cover. This began about 250 years ago. Although the Mahabharata was a violent war, the principle of non-violence is enshrined in the Bhagavad Gita. The principle of non-violence was held in highest esteem, therefore all forms of resistance to colonial powers could not take the form of violent resistance. A superior or divine man or woman, a god or goddess of India, was defined as completely virtuous, completely viceless, of the highest dharma of non-violence, the highest human being who remains within all social boundaries. Consequently, it was against the Hindu religion to resist with any form of violent revolution. It is an interesting and noteworthy paradox that images of spiritual mastery and excellence are depicted with weapons of violence. Krishna's discus was particularly effective in decapitating the enemy. The Bhagavad Gita is the story of a great global conflagration of extreme violence, using weapons whose descriptions closely resemble modern nuclear weapons of mass destruction. The Gita is also the story of an inner war in which the human conscience is caught in an impossible dilemma between the voice of God on the one hand and the voice of conventional religion and moral philosophy on the other. By the 8th century, India had been overrun by Islamic warlords and faced forced conversion to Islam. This was the time when the Hindu religious scholars not only introduced new philosophical doctrines into the ancient religion known as the Adi Sanatan Dharma, but also disguised the ancient knowledge as myths, legends, and improbable stories, together with adding new moral stories that targeted children and uneducated, innocent old women. The matriarchs, so-called uneducated, innocent old women, integrated into the patriarchal system, yet disguised themselves and became the carriers, the invisible guardians and protectors of the ancient wisdom. From the 8th century to the present is called Kali Yuga in India. 1/4 of the 5,000-year time cycle is the time of darkness, also called the darkness of ignorance. The Vedas dominate from this time and promulgate the philosophy of materialism. So it was that in spite of periods of violent intolerance of Hindu thought and practices, the land of India continued in relatively peaceful coexistence of Hindu bhakti, Vedantic Hinduism, and Islam. The advent of the East India Company and its private armies brought political negotiations that set out to divide and rule India, whether Hindu or Islamic. This put a great strain on the status quo and eventually weakened India to breaking point. The Gandhian Revolution ensued. Gandhi was careful to preserve the principle of nonviolence, using the system of civil disobedience or satyagraha to resist. Ultimately, the Gandhian movement resulted in independence, and India was partitioned into a predominantly Hindu India and a predominantly Muslim West and East Pakistan. This moment of August 15th, 1947, erupted into a bloodbath of untold proportions and huge casualties that ripped apart the newly independent countries. Meanwhile, another secret underground spiritual revolution was slowly building up among the older women, responding intuitively to a prophetic call. At exactly the same time, in the United States, Alcoholics Anonymous took birth as an important movement to heal all forms of addiction and a precursor to deep inner spiritual and psychological work. The Gita contains a very well-known and oft-quoted prophecy. It says, "At the time when there is the extreme of adharma and negative karma, I come and I destroy adharma and re-establish true dharma." So adharma means a dysfunctional, disharmonious human society. Although the Gita is very short, it is dense, and its encrypted nature contains a vast encyclopedia of unknown spiritual information. The Gita provides us with very important concepts for counteracting the circumstances of polarization that we are currently in. Perhaps we can say that the moment of spiritual depletion in all parts of the world reached a tipping point or a level that caused a reversal of the trend, prompting a redeeming energy to get released into the world. The essential teachings of the Gita. The question of identity is a major issue for almost all people. Who am I? What am I? Your identity is determined by three elements: what you are, who and what you are in relationship with, and thirdly, what you do. Dharma means what you are. Sambandh means what and who you are in relation to, and karma means what you do. So there is dharma, karma, and sambandh or bandhan. So sambandh is a relationship of harmony, and bandhan means a relationship of bondage. Happiness can be defined as knowing who you are, living in harmonious relationships, and having a history of positive karma. When these are in place, then an individual is called free. And the aim of most religious and political ideals is freedom. The Gita provides information about all these aspects to a degree that far surpasses all other systems of thought. Thus, it is of great interest to us. The Gita is said to have a divine origin. It is the only written piece that declares that a human being is neither male nor female. Your identity is spiritual, not physical. Your body is physical, and you are not your body. You are not a physical object. You are an eternal, indestructible being in the form of a point of non-physical spiritual light that is conscious and can think. The Gita declares that human problems arise due to considering objects of sense perceptions, the material world, as the only reality. When you see a human being, your mind is filled with information concerning that human being's gender, color, race, culture, language, social position, economic bracket, level of education, etc., and you classify that person accordingly. The Gita says this is deceptive. None of that information tells you anything about who this person is in the context of eternity. In the modern world, people who apply algorithms have the intention and assumption that they can know everything about almost all people based on their buying habits, internet searches, etc. But algorithms can reveal only people's most superficial aspects and how they gratify their senses. Unfortunately, the majority of people are shallow like this. The modern world is sharply polarized and conflicted between men and women, the religions, races, cultures, economic conditions, political and economic extremes, and is in a state of imbalance. Everyone is aware about global warming, food insecurity, international conflicts, diseases, economic insecurity, and so on. Many would say that the world is in a state of collapse, yet they close their minds to the enormity of what that statement implies. Globally, people have been socialized through their upbringing, education, exposure to media, and so many environmental stimuli, which goes back at least 1,000 years. We can say there is a planet-wide amnesia regarding the spiritual identity of a human being. Perception of the material world, material reality, and limited ability to perceive the non-material world gave rise to Vedic concepts in and before the 8th century of the current era. These Vedic concepts consist of physical and subtle matter being considered the totality of reality. The conclusion was that everything is one. Physical matter was described as air, earth, fire, water, and ether, and the 6th element of light was discernible to certain yogis. They called it Brahm or Brahman. This is perhaps similar to Einstein's general theory of relativity. A material scientist, with the aid of electronics and technology, is able to perceive many things and dimensions that cannot be seen with the naked eye. However, electronics and technology are aids to enhance visual sense perception. The mystery of life itself can neither be discerned nor perceived using science, nor through enhanced techniques of Hatha Yoga. However, the Gita proposes the third eye. This is the inner eye that can perceive what cannot be seen by sense organs, whether physical or subtle. The third eye is the eye of the soul. The soul can perceive itself when that eye is open. The soul can perceive other souls and can also perceive the Supreme Soul. This perception is not like sense perception. The third eye is called the eye of knowledge, and the Supreme Soul is said to be the giver or opener of the third eye. The mind can be manipulated more easily than the intellect. The mind registers pain, pleasure, attraction, repulsion, and the whole spectrum of feelings. The intellect is connected with conscience, logic, mathematics, calculation, true or false. It is less susceptible to manipulation. Eternal dynamics are laws of spirituality that are described and defined in the Gita. These are not the same as, but they operate in conjunction with, the laws of physics. The Gita makes it clear that if you consider that the universe operates exclusively on the basis of the laws of physics, then you are misguided or blind. There are many realities that you cannot explain this way. The laws of physics cannot explain what is life, nor what is death, nor what takes place in between death and life. The laws of physics cannot explain the philosophy of karma. The Gita explains the laws of karma, akarma, and vikarma, that is, pure, neutral, and negative karma. Human-made moral and legal laws are based on sense perception and religious doctrines. Religious doctrines are based on the patriarchal system. And the patriarchal system means all people are either male or female. Males are superior to females and therefore have more and greater rights. The purpose of the female is to serve the male. The purpose of the male is to rule the world. The purpose of the planet Earth is to serve the dominant males. Happiness is derived from sense gratification. So that's the patriarchal system. This may be very attractive to those in a dominant position. However, there are some problems with this worldview. The Gita is a conversation between a man and God. The man is ambivalent about whether or not he should take the position of a great ruler of the world. God is the creator and the knower of the laws of the universe, the giver of the knowledge of the Gita. The man wants to know how to be a good man. He also wants to perceive God, and in addition, he wants to know the spiritual laws that govern the world, the laws of karma. Their conversation is a continuous argument. The man usually thinks he knows better than God, yet there are moments when he is completely disarmed, humbled, and in awe. What is meditation? The Gita teaches holistic, circular thinking where you do not get lost in the details. This process of circular thinking is the key to productive meditation. Meditation is deep and purposeful, concentrated thought focused on what is worth thinking about. The Gita offers ideas, concepts, and points of information that are deep and contain hidden meanings. The hidden meaning is extracted by concentrating on that idea using circular thinking. For example, the Gita defines the quintessential qualities of the soul as purity, peace, love, power, and bliss. These qualities cannot be experienced directly through sense perception. They can be discerned through the use of metaphor. Poets provide us with marvelous metaphors, and music can carry the soul beyond through tones and melodies of harmony. But to experience these qualities directly is beyond the range of most people. Yoga is the word that defines the mental contact and communion between the depleted soul and the oceanic origin of these qualities. These qualities are the elements of the soul, just as air, earth, fire, water, and ether are considered the elements of matter. The first steps of meditation are to practice discerning these qualities. The most attractive quality to a soul is generally peace. Most people say that they desire peace of mind, so it is relevant to begin with peace. The intellect is the motor that directs the mind to be focused on the source of these qualities. That source is non-terrestrial, non-material, and outside the range of sense perception. The work is to separate the self from the body. This is very subtle mental effort, and practice of various forms of purity help the yogi to achieve this. The time when the soul is most detached from the body is between sleep and waking consciousness. That time is very early in the morning upon awakening. Sleep has to be light. As far as possible, the yogi avoids activities and food and drink that pull the soul strongly into the body, and in particular, the attraction and repulsion of sense perceptions. Spiritual experience occurs in the mind. Physical experience also occurs in the mind. As far as possible, the yogi tries to live in a sato pradhan manner, that means as purely as possible. The mind can be considered similar to a switch. One side is switched towards sensory input, the other to non-sensory input. To achieve this, it is helpful to adopt a position of neutrality or equilibrium regarding good and bad, success and failure, gain and loss, fame and defamation, and other pairs of opposites. The Gita stresses the importance of this practice. The Gita speaks about Raj Yoga. Raj Yoga means the meditation that brings you to a position of dominance over sensory input. But this dominance cannot be accomplished by force. In opposition to Raj Yoga, there is Hatha Yoga. Hatha means force. Raj Yoga involves strengthening the muscle of the intellect or willpower and stabilizing the mind. This takes a lifetime of practice. Therefore, it is meaningful and effective to integrate it into regular, normal daily life, including all the ups and downs, traumas, shocks, surprises, and unexpected circumstances, difficulties, times of boredom, simple pleasures, and so on. To help us in this, the Gita talks about the philosophy of circumstances. It says, the nature of circumstances is that they arise, persist for a while, and then they subside. Nothing remains permanently. When circumstances are unfavorable, they must be endured. The practice of Raj Yoga gradually builds up different forms of power. One is the power to endure unfavorable circumstances. These may persist for a very long time. Thus, the practice of Raj Yoga causes us to achieve patience. Life is usually a long-term reality. The Gita says you get born in circumstances dictated by your karma from your previous birth. You have unpaid accounts and will take birth to those people with whom you have outstanding debts. Some of those people may be indebted to you, and you take birth there so that they can settle their debt to you. The more adept you become in the study of the knowledge of the Gita and the practice of Raj Yoga, the more clearly you can discern the nature and intensity of the debts. Obviously, it requires inner strength and resources to settle outstanding karmic debts. The Gita also discusses in depth the philosophy of karma. It is a tangled and complex matter because while going through the often painful process of settling karmic debts accumulated over many lifetimes, one can easily establish new debts. This is to be avoided. The practice of performing pure karma at each step is greatly to your advantage. What is karma philosophy? Karma is action, thoughts, words, both written and spoken, deeds. All karmas have short-term, medium-term, and long-term consequences. There are consequences to your physical and mental health, your relationships, your social and financial situation, your reputation, and to the circumstances that arise in your life. It cannot be said that any particular act is good or not good. It depends on the intention, the circumstances. It depends on what your action is a response to. It cannot be said that an action is good or bad, but that it becomes good or bad. It is impossible to avoid the consequences of karma. Once a thought, word, or act is performed, its impact is intensified by how often and with what intensity it is repeated. An action that is frequently repeated, whether or not as a response to a particular stimulus, becomes a pattern. That pattern is called a sanskara. The way a person is raised and educated creates patterns of action that come not from the person who is performing the actions, but from the parents and educators and religious authorities who impose those patterns of action on the child or student. Some responsibility for the actions lies with the growing child, but most of the responsibility lies with the parents and educators and religious authorities. Similarly, if you help or facilitate any pure or philanthropic action performed by another person, a percentage of the karmic advantage will accrue to your karmic account. Philanthropic karma is considered very advantageous. The soul functions on the basis of 3 subtle energies. One is the energy of pure karma. Secondly, the energy of the power of yoga. And thirdly, the energy of the soul's individual destiny. None of these energies can be discerned or discovered using sense perception, and therefore, none of these energies can be discerned or discovered scientifically. Yet one more energy needs to be considered. Challenging circumstances may be due to outstanding karmic debts or to destiny, but it can also be that if the soul is very powerful and has an important role in the human story, challenging circumstances may arise to test the soul. Souls with very significant roles must be tested to the limit and beyond in order to bring that soul to the level of experience, competence, and resilience needed to fulfill an extraordinary role. What is time? The material world and the social, political, psychological, and spiritual experience of humanity during these enormous time cycles goes through a very slow but discernible process of winding down. When it reaches a nadir, there is a very fast speeding up of the whole system until it reaches its original potency and another cycle is set in motion. The Gita talks to us about the concept of time. Time goes in one direction, from young to old. The Gita talks about gunas. So gunas are the quality or state of any physical or spiritual entity that is set in the context of time. Time is about change. Everything starts sato pradhan, then becomes sato, then rajo, then tamo pradhan. then disintegrates completely, and then is renewed. The gunas are applied to many things and people to define their quality. The gunas apply to the process of aging and deterioration, but they also apply to other things to differentiate their relative purity or impurity. How does reincarnation work? The Bhagavad Gita declares reincarnation categorically. It says, you get born as an infant, you grow into a child, teenager, adult, mature, then grow old and die, and then you reincarnate. The Gita declares that the self is the soul, which is immortal, indestructible, and eternal. It cannot be killed, but must reincarnate indefinitely. However, as the soul passes through time, there is deterioration, and the soul loses power and purity, becomes corrupt, and requires purification and rejuvenation when it reaches the nadir. So the nadir is the lowest point. As the soul becomes progressively corrupt, the karma becomes progressively, correspondingly negative. And the soul is trapped in the bondage to matter and to Maya. So Maya is defined variously as illusion, vices, negativity, addictive behavior, etc. This ultimately leads to confusion, loss of intelligence, and chaos. The soul searches for purification, for liberation, for knowledge, and ultimately gets reunited with the Supreme Soul, who can and does bring the soul back to its original condition. This, then, is the meaning of the prophecy and promise in the Gita, that when the state of the world becomes completely corrupt, chaotic, in a state of collapse, conflicted and impoverished, unbalanced and powerless, then I, quote unquote, come and restore the world to balance through Dharma, stability, and a new cycle begins. So who is this I, the speaker of the Gita, the Supreme Soul? Purification of the soul. Eternal millennial teachings of the Gita are about the purification of the soul and of the material world. There are 3 ways to achieve purification. One is through disease. The second is through any of the various forms of pain and suffering. And the third is through yoga. The Gita recommends the third way, the way of yoga, Raj Yoga, to be precise. Although disease and suffering may cleanse the soul of impurities, these ways will not restore the soul to its original condition of full power as well as full purity. But Raj Yoga will accomplish this. All souls return to full purity according to their individual capacity. But those souls who wish for full power have the option of claiming as much power as they can. For this, they must practice yoga. Yoga being the conscious contact with the Supreme Power that makes it possible for the soul to draw power into itself through its own will. As much power as you draw, so much is your willpower increased. You can achieve this if you make this your top priority in life. So the most important question is, what do you want? If you want this, then you must set your mind to it. You will encounter much resistance from within and from external sources. The resistance will take the form of fears, desires, doubts, confusion, weakness, addictions, loneliness, and so on. Another important question is, what do you care about, or what motivates you? If you are motivated by love for God and love for humanity and for nature, then you will succeed. You will be an instrument for positive change, and your life, your vibration, your heart will be the instruments to bring about positive, sustainable, good quality life for the people of the world and for the natural world of animals, plants, and all that makes for a balanced, natural world. In this way, you are focused not only on your own internal spiritual and psychological healing, but also whatever you do in this regard sets up a vibration, an energy that heals the world. There is the principle of the microcosm and the macrocosm mirroring each other. Whatever is going on in the macrocosm of the world affects us, can limit us, can pull us down into a vortex of chaos. At the same time, whatever is going on in the microcosm, the individual who chooses to take power and go to the positive future of a restored, rejuvenated world, can pull the macrocosm in that direction. One individual is not so powerful, but when linked to the source of power, knowledge, and purity, then there is no limit to what can be accomplished. This is the teaching of the Bhagavad Gita during these millennial times. What difference does it make if you live according to the knowledge of the Gita? The practical knowledge of the Gita is to make sure that you are sensitive to balance, and that this sensitivity ensures that you keep your life in balance intuitively. A metaphor for this is water finds its own level. Water flows to the ocean, and sea level is the natural place for water to stay quiet. Yet there is a cycle of water. There is constant movement. Water evaporates from the ocean, travels as clouds by wind towards the mountains. It cools and falls as rain, flowing as rivers back to the ocean. And so the cycle keeps on turning endlessly. A human being does not like to remain static. There is an internal urge to improve. There is the ebb and flow, the rising and falling. This is natural and right. The Bhagavad Gita teaches us to be in the flow, to trust, to have faith in the self and in the Supreme Light. A useful aphorism from the Alcoholics Anonymous program is, let go and let God. or the Beatles song, Let It Be. Perhaps the most famous aphorism from the Bhagavad Gita is, "You are your own best friend, and you are your own worst enemy. Choose to be your greatest friend." Very few people realize that this comes from the Bhagavad Gita. Thank you very much. Om Shanti.